He is one of the most famous anonymous people in history. Armed with only 2 shopping bags, he brought an entire column of tanks to a dead stop. Then, just as quickly as he appeared, he vanished. For a single tense moment on June 5th, 1989, this lone, unidentified man became the focus of the world, a symbol of defiance against the crushing power of a state. But his story isn't just about one man. It's the story of hundreds of thousands of people who dared to dream of a different future, and the devastating price they paid. This is the story of who he was and the people he stood for. We'll uncover the chilling personal stories of the protesters in Tiananmen Square and investigate the truth behind the disappearance of the man who became their everlasting icon. Before the tanks, there was hope. The spring of 1989 was unlike any other in modern Chinese history. For years, change had been in the air. After the rigid conformity of the Cultural Revolution, the 1980s brought economic reforms and a rush of new ideas from the outside world. Campuses buzzed with energy. At prestigious schools like Peking University, students gathered to debate China's political future, eagerly reading forbidden texts and listening to reform-minded thinkers. One student, Zhou Fengsuo, later recalled the atmosphere. Everybody was seeking new ideas, new knowledge. It was exciting to learn and discuss how life was changing for the better. This simmering desire for change found its spark on April 15, 1989, with the death of Hu Yaobang. Hu was a popular reformist leader who had been pushed out by party hardliners. His death was a catalyst. At first, students gathered simply to mourn him, but these gatherings quickly grew into a peaceful, powerful political movement. They marched to Tiananmen Square, the symbolic heart of the nation, with clear demands: an end to government corruption, freedom of speech and the press, and greater democratic reform. Rose Tang, a student at the time, remembers being swept up in the moment. "I was shopping nearby and I saw this huge crowd. I was screaming and shouting, so they gave me the bullhorn. I became one of the leaders of my university." For her and countless others, the square became a sanctuary of free expression. You can say anything. You can express yourself without being censored. It was something we had never dreamed of, had never imagined. The movement grew exponentially. What started with students was soon joined by workers, teachers, journalists, and even some government employees. At its peak, over 1 million people filled Tiananmen Square, creating a vibrant, self-organized city within a city. There were makeshift tents, a supply chain for food and water, and even unofficial weddings. Protesters gave out birthday cake and shared breakfast, creating a sense of community and shared purpose that China hadn't seen since 1949. For a few precious weeks, the impossible felt like it was within reach. One protester recalled the feeling that they had reached a historic moment, believing they might finally seize control of their own fate. The air wasn't thick with fear, but with the exhilarating possibility of change. This crescendo of hope was perhaps best embodied by the erection of a 30-foot statue directly facing Mao Zedong's portrait on the Gate of Heavenly Peace. They called her the Goddess of Democracy. Built in just 4 days by art students, she was a powerful symbol of the movement's aspirations, modeled after the Statue of Liberty. For the protesters, she represented the future they were fighting for. For the government, she was an intolerable act of defiance. The feeling in the square was one of triumph. Mark Avery, a photographer for the Associated Press, was there. When they woke the next morning and the army didn't come, there was this exhilarated feeling of, "We survived." But this feeling of invincibility was a fragile illusion. The government's patience was wearing thin. The government didn't respond with tanks at first. It responded with words. An editorial in the state-run People's Daily on April 26th branded the protests a planned conspiracy and a turmoil designed to overthrow the Communist Party. This was a clear warning. The students, however, were undeterred. To prove their commitment, hundreds began a hunger strike in mid-May, a dramatic escalation that won them widespread sympathy and swelled the crowds even more. One of the hunger strike leaders was a charismatic 23-year-old psychology student named Chai Ling. She became the commander-in-chief of the protesters in the square, her voice rallying the exhausted but determined students through loudspeakers. As the standoff intensified, the government's rhetoric hardened. On May 20th, Premier Li Peng declared martial law. Beijing was now officially under military control. The People's Liberation Army, an institution meant to protect the people, was ordered to clear the city. But the people of Beijing resisted. For days, ordinary citizens, men and women, young and old, flooded the streets, forming human barricades to block the military convoys. They pleaded with the soldiers, telling them the students were peaceful patriots, not criminals. And incredibly, for a short time, it worked. Some soldiers, local to Beijing, appeared to fraternize with the citizens, and many convoys turned back without a fight. This temporary victory, however, only solidified the resolve of the government's hardliners. They saw the protests not as a call for reform, but as a direct challenge to their authority. Unwilling to lose control, they brought in troops from outside provinces, soldiers who had no connection to the city and had been fed propaganda that portrayed the protesters as violent, counter-revolutionary rioters. The night of June 3rd, 1989, was when hope finally died. The final assault began. From multiple directions, tens of thousands of heavily armed troops and tanks advanced toward the city center. This time, they would not be turned back. Eyewitness accounts from that night are harrowing. Qi Zhiyong, a 33-year-old construction worker, was on his way to the square when the shooting started. He would later lose his leg. "I witnessed with my own eyes tanks on Chang'an Avenue, going into crowds of people and crush citizens," he recalled. "Bicycles, railings, and such blocked the way, but the tanks just rolled right over them." Another witness described the scene. "Soldiers were shooting at civilians, and more followed the tanks on foot, also firing. People were lying wounded on the road. I hope I never see as many dead bodies as I saw that night." Gunfire erupted without warning. Soldiers fired indiscriminately into the crowds of unarmed protesters and onlookers. People were shot in the back as they tried to flee. A journalist, watching from a dimly lit street, saw soldiers fire relentlessly as citizens threw bricks at military vehicles. In the chaos, ambulances struggled to reach the wounded, their sirens wailing against the constant crackle of automatic weapons. Inside the square, the remaining students huddled around the monument to the people's heroes. After a tense vote, they agreed to evacuate. Just then, the lights in the square were suddenly extinguished, plunging them into darkness. Soldiers rushed in, beating people with rifles and iron bars. By dawn on June 4th, the army had taken complete control of Tiananmen Square. The pavement was stained with blood, and an Orwellian silence descended on the city. The protests were over. The massacre was complete. The morning of June 5th dawned on a city under military occupation. Chang'an Avenue, the Avenue of Eternal Peace, was a landscape of military might. A long column of Type 59 tanks rumbled down the wide, empty boulevard, a final assertion of the state's absolute power. And then, the unthinkable happened. From the side of the road, a lone man stepped into their path. He was of average build, dressed simply in a white shirt and dark trousers. In one hand, he held a shopping bag. In the other, another. He was the image of an ordinary person, someone you might pass on the street without a second glance. Yet he stood, motionless, directly in the path of the lead tank. The massive machine ground to a halt just feet from him. The tank driver tried to maneuver around him, first to the right, then to the left. Each time, the man simply sidestepped, repositioning himself to block its path. It was a surreal, personal standoff between a single, unarmed individual and a multi-ton war machine. At one point, he even gestured at the tank with one of his shopping bags. Growing bolder, he then did something even more astonishing. He climbed onto the hull of the lead tank. He appeared to speak with a crew member through a driver's hatch. Though we can't hear their conversation, his body language was one of desperate, urgent appeal. After a few moments, he climbed down. The tank engine revved, but it didn't move forward. The standoff continued. Finally, two men ran into the street, grabbed the man, and hurriedly pulled him away into the crowd. The tanks then proceeded on their way. The entire confrontation lasted only a few minutes, but it was captured by a handful of Western photographers and a cameraman, all watching from the balconies of the nearby Beijing hotel. The image was instantly iconic, a modern-day David and Goliath. Time magazine would later name him one of the 100 most important people of the 20th century, dubbing him the unknown rebel. But who was he? And what happened to him? This is the central haunting mystery of Tiananmen Square. To this day, his identity and his fate remain unknown. In the immediate aftermath, speculation was rampant. A British tabloid gave him the name Wang Weilin, claiming he was a 19-year-old student who was later executed. This name has been widely circulated, but no credible evidence has ever emerged to support it. The reporter who wrote the story later admitted he invented the name. The Chinese government itself has remained almost entirely silent. When asked about the man in a 1990 interview, then Communist Party leader Jiang Zemin stated he couldn't confirm if the man was arrested, but added, "I think never killed." Over the decades, several theories have emerged. One is that he was executed by a firing squad weeks or months after the protest. Another, more hopeful theory suggests he was whisked away by ordinary citizens who helped him escape, and that he may still be living quietly and anonymously somewhere in mainland China. There were even rumors that he escaped to Taiwan and worked as an archaeologist, though this was later denied. Internal Communist Party documents, reportedly seen by a Hong Kong-based human rights group, stated that authorities themselves could not find him. One official was quoted as saying, "We can't find him. We got his name from journalists. We have checked through computers but can't find him among the dead or among those in prison." The identity of the men who pulled him away is key to this mystery. If they were agents of the Public Security Bureau, his fate was almost certainly prison or death. If they were concerned onlookers, he may have had a chance to disappear back into the vastness of China. The story of the Tank Man is the story of individual courage, but it's also the story of a collective dream. His solitary act gave a face to the countless others who stood for freedom in 1989. People like Qi Zhiyong, who lost his leg but never his spirit, and Chai Ling, who led the hunger strike and was forced into exile. Their stories and the mystery of the man who stood for them must not be forgotten. If you believe these histories are important, subscribe to the channel and share this video. In the comments below, let us know what the image of the Tank Man means to you. He-Man with the shopping bags is the icon, but he stood for a generation. Behind his singular image are the faces and stories of thousands of others whose lives were shattered by the events of June 4th. After the crackdown, the government began a systematic hunt for those involved, labeling them counter-revolutionaries. On June 13th, the Beijing Public Security Bureau released a list of its 21 most wanted student leaders. Their faces were broadcast on television, turning them into fugitives in their own country. Chai Ling, whose impassioned speeches had echoed across the square, was number 4 on that list. She and her then-husband, Feng Congde, another student leader, managed a daring escape. They fled Beijing and spent 10 months in hiding, moving across China before being smuggled to Hong Kong by an underground network called Operation Yellowbird, and eventually making their way to the United States. Looking back, she described the moment the dream died. When the government sent tanks and troops to kill its very own children, its very own people, then that belief was completely crushed. Others weren't so lucky. Zhou Fengsuo, the student who had been so excited by the intellectual ferment of the 1980s, was also on the most wanted list. He was arrested after his own sister turned him in, and he spent a year in prison before being released. Many served much longer sentences. Wang Dan, who topped the most wanted list, was arrested and imprisoned, and after a brief release was sentenced to another 11 years for subversion. But the crackdown reached far beyond the well-known student leaders. It swept up ordinary citizens who had offered support. Qi Zhiyong, the construction worker shot in the leg, spent the rest of his life as a marked man. After his amputation, he was forced out of his job and remained unemployed. He became a relentless activist, speaking out about the massacre and facing constant harassment from authorities until his death. Then there were the mothers. Ding Zilin, a retired philosophy professor, became a powerful voice for accountability after her 17-year-old son, Jiang Jielian, was killed on the night of June 3rd. She founded the Tiananmen Mothers, a group of relatives of the victims who have tirelessly campaigned for the government to acknowledge the truth, provide compensation, and hold those responsible to account. For their efforts, they are subjected to routine detention, interrogation, and intense surveillance, especially around the anniversary of the massacre. The government's official death toll remains a point of contention. The official figure released by the Chinese government was 241 dead, including soldiers, and 7,000 wounded. However, diplomatic cables released years later and numerous eyewitness accounts suggest the number was much higher, possibly in the thousands. One witness recalled seeing soldiers putting people into large plastic bags. He later heard from police sources that a group of around 200 young people had been secretly executed on June 9th. The true number of those killed, wounded, and imprisoned may never be known. Today, inside China, the Tank Man has been almost completely erased. An entire generation has grown up without ever seeing the image or learning about the protests. The Chinese government has engaged in one of the most sophisticated and successful censorship campaigns in history. Any mention of the Tiananmen Square Massacre, references to June 4th, the numbers 8,964, or even the word today on the anniversary, is scrubbed from the internet by an army of censors. Search engines filter out any results. School textbooks omit the event entirely. Young people in China shown the iconic photograph today often don't recognize it. The physical space of Tiananmen Square itself has been scrubbed clean. It is now a tourist attraction, monitored by a dense web of surveillance cameras. There is no plaque, no memorial, no official acknowledgement of the blood that was spilled there. The government's goal is total, enforced amnesia. Yet, outside of China, the image of the Tank Man endures as one of history's most powerful symbols of defiance. His anonymity is his strength. Because we don't know his name, he can be anyone. He is the student, the worker, the ordinary citizen who, in a moment of extraordinary courage, decides they have had enough. He represents the idea that even in the face of overwhelming mechanized force, the human spirit can refuse to be broken. His simple shopping bags are a powerful reminder that heroes are often ordinary people who find themselves in extraordinary circumstances. His act of defiance was a final tragic gesture of the 1989 protests. It didn't stop the crackdown or change the course of the Chinese government, but it seared an unforgettable image into the world's collective memory, ensuring that what happened on those bloody days in June would not be entirely forgotten. The man in front of the tanks remains a ghost in the machine of Chinese censorship, a persistent symbol of an event the state wants the world to forget. His identity remains a mystery, his fate unknown. But his legacy is clear. He is the unknown soldier of peaceful protest, a silent testament to the enduring power of a single individual to stand up for what is right, no matter the cost.